Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Tuesday Talent Series on Tuesday, September 17th. We're excited to have Adam Shake here to present the basics of the Americans with Disabilities Act for employers. We would first like to recognize our sponsor, Plant Moran, for hosting us today. Plant Moran is among the nation's largest accounting, tax, consulting, and wealth management firms and provides a full line of services to organizations in the following industries: manufacturing and distribution, financial services, service, healthcare, private equity, public sector, real estate, construction, and energy. This year in 2024, they're proudly celebrating 100 years. Plant Moran has a staff of more than 3,300 professionals throughout the United States, with international offices in Shanghai, China, Mumbai, India, Tokyo, Japan, and Monterrey, Mexico. In Colorado, Plant Moran has served its Colorado clients for more than 40 years, with offices in Broomfield, Denver, and Fort Collins. Plant Moran has been recognized by a number of organizations, including Fortune magazine, as one of the country's best places to work. For more information, please visit plantmoran.com. All right, we're excited to have Adam Shake here today. Adam spent 15 years in the military, 10 years working in Washington, D.C., and he and his wife have lived in Estes Park since 2012. Adam is the previous CEO of the Estes Park Economic Development Corporation and current business outreach specialist representing Northern Colorado for the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment Division of Vocational Rehabilitation. Adam, thank you for being here today.
Absolutely.
We're excited for your topic, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can start your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. Let me get set up here a second. Okay, and let's do this. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay? Okay, excellent. All right, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for your time, right? Time is like the most important thing we have. It's worth more than money or anything else. So the fact that you guys are taking out a little bit of your time to listen to me today really means a lot to me. Hopefully you'll walk away from this having learned something. Yeah, I'm Adam Shake, and I have been with the DVR, Division of Vocational Rehab, now for about 10 months. I started in November of last year. It's very exciting. This is one of the things that I love to do. We do a number of free training classes. This one, the basics of ADA for employers. I also do a disability etiquette for employers, and that one is more for outward-facing companies, organizations and companies that deal with the general public, things like that. So I really like that one as well. We also have another one called Breaking Barriers to Employment. I do that with a lot of different HR departments. We talk about skills-based hiring. We talk about, just all of the different things when it comes to putting your job descriptions out there, using the correct language, staying away from boilerplate language from 20 years ago in your job description, so on and so forth. So this training is one of the things I really enjoy. Having said that, I'd like to kind of go around the room a little bit and have each one of you introduce yourselves very quickly. I know that's not done often in these kinds of meetings, but I think that's important. So starting on my left, Mark, it's good to see you.
There we go. Yeah, good to see you too. My name is Mark Ewing. I'm a senior recruiting specialist with City of Fort Collins.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. Caroline?
My name is Carolee Cosner, and I'm a wellness advisor for Unified Workforce.
Excellent. Thank you. And hey, Linda, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm Linda Ray, and I get to work with Adam, and I love that you're here listening to the great information that he's going to be sharing.
Linda takes care of our business relations unit, so she's kind of our go-to when it comes to anything that we need. So appreciate you coming in, Linda. And looks like DG.
Hi, that's Dana Yilda, and I am an HR manager with Columbine Health Systems.
Excellent. Thank you, Dana. All right. Well, let's get right into it. Let's see. All right. Before we can begin, I have to provide this quick legal disclaimer, which basically says, well, it doesn't basically say it, it actually says, the audience is cautioned that the information contained in this presentation is intended solely as informal guidance and should not be used for determining your legal rights or responsibilities under the law, and is not binding on any agency with enforcement responsibilities under the ADA. Basically, what this means is that I'm not a lawyer, and you should not take anything that I'm saying in here as legal advice. All right, so at DVR, we really do believe, and when I say this, you know, I think we have all really drunk the Kool-Aid on this. We all really believe this. This is not just one of those corporate strategy vision type things, but we believe that all people with disabilities can choose a career path that leads to meaningful employment. Basically, we believe that anyone with a disability, regardless of what that disability is, who wants sustainable employment, can find sustainable employment. We just need to help them find that employment. Through this belief, we seek to be a resource and a partner to not only all the people that we serve, but also to the business needs in our communities and to you. And because of this, we strive to continuously improve our efforts and practices through active collaboration with the people we serve, their families, businesses, and other national, state, and local organizations. In today's presentation, we're going to start by defining disability. So, what is disability? Then we'll cover the basics of the ADA and how it came to be. And it's very important for the audience today to have a firm understanding of the employer responsibilities and what other need to know elements of the ADA means. And of course, we want to leave you with more resources on the ADA as it's a continual learning process. All right, starting with disability. When we hear the word disability, we each have probably a different picture of what comes to mind. But what does it actually mean? If you're somebody with a disability, you may imagine yourself. If you're somebody without a disability, you might imagine a family member or somebody you know, a friend, or somebody that you meet regularly in the grocery store. But what you need to understand is that if you know or have met somebody with a disability, then you know one person with a disability. Disability is different from person to person, and disability is experienced differently from person to person. So what is disability? A lot of times I talk about how the ADA defines disability, and you may think that it's pretty narrowly defined, but the ADA really has a very broad concept of disability. So ADA defines disability in three different ways. The first one is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So that's pretty easy to understand, right? One or more major life activities, typically in our minds, we think about seeing, hearing, physical mobility. You can even go down into touch, taste, feel, smell, things like that. But the ADA goes a little bit further, as it also defines a disability as a person who has a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. So that one can be a little kind of surprising or maybe confusing to some people. So what is a record of such an impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability? So I always use myself as an example, just because it's part of who I am. I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer in 2020. I went through a cancer journey and chemo and immunotherapy and radiation. I am completely disease free. I go and have a CT scan every 6 months. I have one this afternoon. So I'm one of the lucky ones, right? But I will always be in remission. I will be in remission until I'm not, or until I die. Now, if that was used against me when I was applying for a job, let's say I was applying for a position and an employer did not want to hire me because of a previous medical condition, as an example, I would fall under this one. Person who has a record of such an impairment, even if they don't currently have a disability. So that's just one example. And the next one is even a little bit stranger, but it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. It's a person who does not have a disability, but is regarded as having a disability. So what does that mean? That means somebody who may have been in a house fire, as an example, as a teenager, and they have some scarification on their face, and they apply for a position, and they are discriminated against because of the way that they look, because of the scarification. This may be somebody who is completely qualified for the position, and they're not hired. So they've been discriminated against. So this is where that comes in, right? The thing about disability, and we may talk about this a little bit later, is I always say disability is a one minority that any one of us can join at any time, right? And so what this does is it really takes it takes the narrow definition of disability and it really opens it up. All right, let's break down some overarching elements to keep in mind in regards to disability. Disability can be apparent or non-apparent. It's not always readily identifiable that somebody has a disability, right? We use the term hidden disability a lot. And I will tell you that a very large proportion of the people I work with at DVR and who our counselors work with have hidden disabilities. In other words, you wouldn't know by looking at them walking across a parking lot, or maybe even in the first couple hours that they have a disability. So disability can happen at birth and gestation, or it can be brought on over time. Sometimes disability happens in the womb, or it's diagnosed at birth, or this is something that may happen later in life as a result of illness or injury. I just had a really good conversation with somebody yesterday, and we were talking about aging into disability. 100% of us are going to age into disability, unless you have some catastrophic event that takes your life right away. So that's what that is. Born with or developed over time. It can be experienced temporarily or permanently. It can last a short term, or it can last your whole life. And finally, disability can be in more than one category, and you can have multiple types of disabilities at the same time. But the most important thing to remember is that disability affects all of us, right? All genders, classes, races, and communities, and it does not discriminate. With that said, we at DVR feel that regardless of the type or severity of disability, like I said, all individuals with disabilities are capable of achieving employment should they choose to pursue it. I've provided here just a couple examples of different types of disabilities people may have that we often support at DVR, but this is not an exhaustive list of disabilities at all. I mean, there are literally hundreds of disabilities. And, one of the things I talk about quite a bit is we use the word spectrum when it comes to autism a lot, but I use the word spectrum when it comes to disability in general, right? Disability can start all the way down with attention deficit disorder, ADD, ADHD, OCD, a lot of these hidden disabilities. And then you can work your way all the way up through the cognitive, through the physical, through the emotional, through the physical, all the way up to full blindness, full deafness, full immobility, things of that nature. So disability really is a spectrum. All right, let's talk about the importance of the ADA. The ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act, is not the first piece of legislation to shift the paradigm of how society sees and embraces disability. It had been a long time coming, and many people had hard-fought battles that had to take place first in order to get to where we are today. It's fundamental that we have an understanding of how the ADA came into being, so that you have full comprehension of how important the ADA is today and how far we still have to go, right? That's one of the things that I stress a lot. We cannot be prepared for the future without knowing our past. So long before we had the ADA, we had what's called the Soldiers Rehab Act of 1918. This act was put into place to support disabled veterans returning home from war and to help them return to employment. Now, at that time, this was only in place for veterans, and this was seen as a way to kind of rehabilitate them. It wasn't until 55 years later, though, and with the strong civil rights movements that were taking place throughout the 1960s and 70s, that we got the Rehab Act of 1973. This piece of legislation created and extended laws for all people with disabilities, adults and children, especially in education and employment, right? So it went to veterans and it started to help cover adults and children, especially in education and employment. Here's a little bit of Colorado history for you. 5 years later, the Gang of 19 laid themselves down in front of the RTD buses and refused to move for 24 hours in protest of the lack of access to transportation on bus routes. That happened right at the corner of Broadway and Colfax in Denver, and it spurred nationwide recognition and other protests throughout the country, all in the pursuit of stronger and better civil rights laws for people with disabilities. There's some video out there as well of individuals with mobility issues, and specifically for its time, I guess it went viral, right? But this is kind of pre-internet, of a little girl in a wheelchair who was crawling up the steps of the Capitol, kind of symbolically getting up the steps of the Capitol to talk to the legislatures in the Capitol. And that was really powerful. And that got played on all the CBS, ABC, NBC News, and really helped kick this thing off. 17 years after the Rehab Act of 1973 was when we finally got the most comprehensive disability laws to date with the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law by Bush Sr. on July 26, 1990. So if you think about that, the ADA has not been around for that long. I mean, almost everybody in this room was alive when that happened. What this does is it prohibits the discrimination of and guarantees equal opportunities for people with disabilities in all areas of mainstream life. That's really important to think about. All areas of mainstream life. This meant that people with disabilities should be able to access all amenities that those without disabilities can in a public setting. So that's really important to remember. So the ADA provides clear and comprehensive definitions of disability, and it really shifts the definition from a medical model to a more social model. We know that the ADA says that a person with a disability is someone with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And it also goes on, like we talked about, defines a person who's had an impairment, even if that impairment is not currently impacting their life, and a person who does not have an impairment, but is kind of seen by society as having an impairment. What this has done for the disability community and those who support people with disabilities is that it's provided them with the protections from discrimination, especially in areas of education and employment, whereas before they didn't have any legal standing to get justice. It also promoted the inclusion of people with disabilities into every single area of public life and society, when before people with disabilities were silently and sometimes not so silently encouraged to stay away from public life. It made accessibility a part of that conversation, and while we still have a long way to go, it made it law that people with disabilities should have access to the world around them. Now that we kind of talked a little bit about the history and how we got to this point, let's talk about what you as employers really need to know for your workplace in order to attract, hire, and retain and promote individuals with disabilities in your company. In this section, we're going to cover the basics of the ADA and the terms that you really need to remember when hiring people with disabilities. What we often see is that employers aren't understanding what the ADA means when it states things like essential functions, a qualified individual, or reasonable accommodations. A lot of times employers are operating off their implicit bias, and they're not assuming that the person with a disability is not considered qualified due to their disability, or that because of their disability, they cannot perform essential functions or even non-essential functions with reasonable accommodations, or they believe that those accommodations are going to be ongoing or expensive. So I just want to quickly throw in here, I'm going to be speaking at the Larimer County Workforce Symposium on the 24th. I don't know if anybody else is going to be there, but one of the things we're talking about is myths, right? Myth busting and all that kind of stuff when it comes to individuals with disabilities. So we really get into this a little bit about things like it's going to be expensive, there's a liability. We talk about things like retention of individuals with disabilities is actually higher than individuals who are able. I just want to throw that in there. I think it's really interesting and important. But because of implicit bias is likely playing an active role in presenting some of these barriers for people with disabilities, it's part of the reason why that despite the ADA's progress in so many areas of life, employment has statistically remained an area of life in which people with disabilities struggle to achieve equal opportunities. To kind of put that into real life perspective, you can take any kind of full-time employment work with aged people and cut that in half with people with disabilities. So if you have or more, right? If your unemployment rate is, you know, we'll just make up a number. If it's 8%, it's probably 20% or higher with individuals with disabilities. You can also take just about any other statistic, poverty rate, and cut that in half again. You know, if there's a 10% poverty rate, there's probably a 20% poverty rate when it comes to individuals with disabilities. So that's important to understand. It's why it's important for employers to understand and interpret the ADA kind of as it's intended. Who does it apply to? It applies to employers who have over 15 employees, and that can include, and it does include part-time employees as well, not just full-time. And beyond that, any employers who are private, local, and state government, employment agencies, labor unions, and more. So you can pretty much just say that the ADA covers just about everybody. Also, the ADA applies to all employment practices, like the ones I've listed here. And I could talk about this for days as well, right? So it starts with the application process. So a lot of employers don't understand that the ADA actually starts with the application process and goes through recruiting, hiring, it goes through promotions, it extends through training and wages, job assignments, benefits, social activities, privileges, leave, all the way up through termination. So from the time somebody sees your job application or your job announcement on Indeed until the day they retire, or they get let go, or they voluntarily leave the workplace, the ADA is throughout that whole process. What all that means is that someone with a disability is protected from discrimination, and employers are responsible for upholding the ADA at every single one of those points. Essential functions is important. When you have an opening for a position and you're creating a position description, you have to make sure that you are clearly defining the essential functions of the role. So how do you do this? There are essential functions, and then there's kind of like would like to have functions, right? And so a lot of times employers get these two mixed up. Being able to lift 25 pounds may not be an essential function. I kind of have a problem with this one as well, right? Because how many of us really have to lift 25 pounds? Having a driver's license, unless you're driving a fleet vehicle or you're driving for work during work hours, absolutely, driver's license is important. But it's up to the individual to get themselves to work and home from work. Having a driver's license does not, it shouldn't be an essential job function, right? Because there are a lot of blind folks who work in person and they don't have driver's licenses. right? And so history has proven that people can get to their job. So there's a lot of that kind of essential function versus this is what we'd like. And you have to kind of ask yourself, does this position exist to form a task, right? Every position should exist to perform a task. And if yes, what is that task? And if it's not an essential function, can the task, as an example, be easily distributed to other members of the team? If yes, then is it essential for this role? If no, consider if reasonable accommodations can be used to have that in mind, right? We'll talk about reasonable accommodations here in a little bit. What level of skill or expertise is required, right? Is a bachelor's degree really required for this position, or a master's degree, right? So it's important to ask those kinds of questions. All right, some terms to remember. Let's assume that you have somebody apply for work at your business and it's either obvious that they have a disability or they have disclosed this up front. What do you need to know when it comes to considering in hiring them? The first thing is determining if they're a qualified individual for the role. Now, a qualified individual is someone who meets the skills, education, experience, and other job-related tasks of a position, and who, with or without reasonable accommodations, can perform the essential job functions of that position, right? The last part about with or without reasonable accommodations is where we find that sometimes employers are skipping over. There is the idea that if they need accommodations, then the person is not qualified, right? The ADA says that there could be nothing further from the truth. Just because they may need a reasonable accommodation does not mean that they are unqualified for that position. If there's anything I say here today, that's probably one of the most important things. But the state or the law states that accommodations must be considered in determining if someone is qualified, right? I work with a lot of different businesses, organizations, large employers, small employers. And we love it when they hire people that are in our DVR program. But one of the things that I always say is you have to hire the most qualified individual, right? Just because we have a relationship with them or I'm in meetings with them doesn't mean that they're going to hire somebody out of my program if there's another individual that's more qualified. But this reasonable accommodations piece is really important. All right, keeping an eye on my time here. Couple terms to remember. When it comes to reasonable accommodations, any change in the work environment or the way the job is performed that enables a person with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities is typically done in 3 different ways. One is through the application process. Changes made to the application process. Again, is the driver's license really required? Do you really have to lift 25 pounds? So on and so forth. The work environment, changes made to the work environment or how the job is actually done. I'll give you an example. A lot of folks that are autistic, as an example, some of the best employees in the world, but they're sensitive to sound and they're sensitive to light, especially if being in a meeting where you've got 5 different people all talking at the same time, it's hard for them, right? So you may have an autistic employee or pretty much anybody else that requests that they don't have to have the light on in their office when they're at their computer, right? Because they're sensitive to light, or that they're able to wear noise canceling headphones when they're doing a task at their computer. So those kinds of things would be considered reasonable accommodations. Now, if you have an employee or a possible employee that says during a job interview, I'm sensitive to light, or I may need noise canceling headphones once in a while, that in and of itself does not mean that they're not qualified for the position. So that's important. And equal access. Changes made that allowed for equal access to the benefits and privileges of employment. So here I also talk about aging into disability, right? I mean, as an employer, you would love to have an employee that was with you for 30 years and actually retired from your organization, right? I can guarantee you that if somebody starts at the age of 30, by the time they're 60, they might need a larger monitor because they're suffering from some vision loss, or they may need headphones because they're hard of hearing, or they may need screen readers and things like that. You wouldn't think about letting them go because they need those kinds of reasonable accommodations. So it's important to think about that during the hiring process. Here are just a couple examples of reasonable accommodations when it comes to autism, cerebral palsy, and brain injury. Let me see here. Another example is, say you have an employee who has cerebral palsy, and as an essential function of their job is to work at the company provided computer. Many people with cerebral palsy often use the mobility assistance of a specialized automated wheelchair, right? So if somebody comes to you and you have an employee, let's say they've been with you for a year or 5 years or 10 years, and on the way home from work one day, they get in a car accident and they snap their leg, and they're in the hospital for a week. Then they come back to work and they're in a wheelchair and they say, hey, look, I could really use a standing desk. As an employer, almost 100% of those employers can be like, yeah, let me spend the $200 to buy you a standing desk because you suffered, this broken leg. But if somebody comes to you and says, let's say they're hired and they're in a wheelchair, are you as an employer going to consider that reasonable accommodation for a standing desk? That's just one example. All right, requesting a reasonable accommodations. This is one that not a lot of, but HR departments kind of like, okay, I understand the concept of reasonable accommodations, but how does someone with a reasonable accommodation actually officially request that, right? I get this question a lot of times. Our counselors get this question as well from people in our program. First one is always, do I self-identify in the job application, right? What are the risks and rewards for doing that? And the second one is, how do I ask for a reasonable accommodation, right? So first of all, it's up to the person and not the employer to ask for the reasonable accommodation, or even the employer to offer a reasonable accommodation if he sees a disability in the workplace. So this is important to understand too, right? It's really up to the individual to request a reasonable accommodation. You, under the employer, are under no obligation to provide reasonable accommodations if they have not been asked of you. However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be aware or sensitive to the fact that some may not know exactly how to do this. That's why this training is super important. When an employee or applicant asks for one, a reasonable accommodation, it doesn't necessarily need to be in writing. So the ADA and the EEOC too, if you look at how they work, they don't say a reasonable accommodation has to be in writing to the head of the HR department to be put in their personal professional file. As an example, a reasonable accommodation may be a verbal request. It may be a written request. It can be made to, it should usually be made to the job supervisor, so on and so forth. At that point, it's up to the employer. It's the employer's responsibility to take that reasonable accommodation request, and if they think it's necessary, to go ahead and write something up and put that in the file. This typically happens when there's money involved and the employer has to do something like buy a new monitor, buy a larger monitor, or spend money on a standing desk or something like that, right? If it's as simple as somebody saying, can I turn the lights off in my office so that the overheads don't mess with my eyes? There's no reason to write something like that up, right? Unless the employer thinks it might be necessary. It doesn't need to be in writing. Once a request is made, the employer can get it in writing and submit it to the authorities. Typically, this happens when the money is spent. And oftentimes, very large employers like to create a process for this kind of thing. All right. Remember that if a reasonable accommodation causes undue hardship, then the employer is not required to provide one. An employer does not have to provide a reasonable accommodation just because it's asked, right? The ADA says that if it causes a reasonable hardship, then they do not. This is based on a case-by-case basis and depends on the type and scale of the business as well. Because of this, employers can try to offer other options for accommodation, which is why that often open communication and documentation is so important. The accommodation still has to be effective at helping the individual complete their essential functions of the job, but it doesn't always have to be determined solely by the individual alone, right? Some people just run colder than some people and they like a little space heater under their desk. I would say it's up to the employer. That could be considered a reasonable accommodation. I know typically people who've gone through cancer treatment are cold the rest of their lives. And I know I run a little bit colder than I used to. So that could be considered a reasonable accommodation. But if the fire marshal says no space heaters in the building, then the employer does not have to give in to that reasonable accommodation request. Something else can be tried, right? As the employer, once a reasonable accommodation is requested, you can also ask for documentation to help with the determination of needed accommodations. This can get a little bit sticky, right? So somebody comes to you with a reasonable accommodation, and as an employer, you have every right to say, can I have some kind of medical documentation saying that you would benefit from this reasonable accommodation? That usually stays within the HR department. That can be considered classified or confidential information. At that point, the person requesting the accommodation would need to provide some kind of medical documentation stating the need for that accommodation. Depending on the doctor, they may or may not say what the disability is. And to be honest with you, it's not really up to the employer at any point to say, what is your disability? If they want to self-identify, that's fine. All right, let's go beyond the basics just for a little bit and talk about some of the other topics that often come up with regards to the ADA. We often get questions about service animals, right? Everybody has a question about a service animal, like they have an aunt or an uncle who has a service dog. They may be a veteran or something like that, or a friend. We often get questions about them, whereas a person who has a service animal and has applied for a position and the employer is not sure how to go about this because they've never experienced hiring somebody with a service animal. That's just one example. So kind of let's go over the rules of what qualifies as a service animal. So I was recently in a training and she said, a service animal is only a dog, or a dog, unless it's a miniature pony, right? It is not a cat. It is not an iguana. It is not a bird. It is not a ferret. Those are emotional support animals, and we'll talk about those a little bit differently. The service animal is a dog. It can be any breed of dog. So the service animal must be individually trained animal. This is important to do work or perform a task or tasks for the benefit of an individual with a disability. Now, a lot of people say, why the miniature horse? I haven't really nailed that down, but I've heard some pretty good stuff. And what they say is that for those people who fall down or are prone of having a seizure or something, maybe they have trouble getting out of a chair, a miniature horse is better, because unlike a dog, you can put a lot of pressure on a miniature horse to stand up, right? So they're used as a bracing tool. I still have yet to see one in the workplace. I have yet to see a miniature horse as a service animal, but it's in there, right? All right, so that's what it is. It's a dog, or a dog of any breed, or unless it's a miniature horse, and it is providing a service animal does fall under Title I of the ADA as a reasonable accommodation. And the employer may not require documentation or proof of certification for entry. We'll talk about that here in a second. All right, let's talk about allowances and exclusions. When you're interviewing a person who uses a service animal, there are only two questions that you're allowed to ask them, right? Is the dog a service animal required because of a disability? And the ADA doesn't say that you have to memorize this and say only those words, right? But as long as you kind of get that out, you can say, is a dog a service animal required because of your disability or a disability or something like that, right? And the second one is, What work or tasks has the dog been trained to perform? You are allowed to ask that. What work or tasks is the dog trained to perform? And that's a good one to ask, right? Because they can tell you, right? But that's not what, that's what you're allowed to ask. What you're not allowed to ask for is documentation. Because, and here's a simple reason for this. Anybody can go on the internet and buy documentation for, anywhere between $1 and $10, or however much you want to spend. Anybody can make their own documentation and make it look legal. So there's really no point in this. Anybody can go to Amazon and buy a service animal or service dog vest for $9.99 as well, right? So that's one of the things you're not allowed to ask. You're not allowed to require that the dog demonstrate its task. That's kind of understandable, but it really becomes understandable when you know that there are dogs out there that are trained to smell your breath to determine where your blood sugar's at, whether you're about to go into some kind of a seizure or something like that. Now, that dog can't perform that task if your blood sugar is not low, right? Dogs that are trained to know when you're going to go into a seizure is a great example. It's one of the reasons why you're not allowed to ask them if they can perform that task, and you're not allowed to inquire about the person's nature of their disability, right? So those are the three things you cannot ask. Let's talk for a second about exclusions for permitting a service animal. You are allowed as an employer not to approve that reasonable accommodation for a service animal if admitting the animal would fundamentally alter the nature of the service or program. So I tend to use over-the-top examples, but there's a tea house down in, I think it's in Loveland, that is a cat tea house. It's where they have cats. It's where you can bring your cat, right? Bringing your service dog into that tea house to hang out with you, probably not a good idea, right? So that's one example that would alter the nature of their service or program. And the other one is if the animal is not under control. So the ADA, when looking at this, the ADA will say if the dog barks more than 3 times in an hour, I believe, or if the dog is growling or aggressive, if the dog is not trained to, if the dog relieves itself, if the dog does any of those things at any time, doesn't matter, you can ask the individual to leave with the service animal. There's a lot more under service animals that I could talk about. An employer is not allowed to feed or water a service animal. An employer is not allowed to take the leash of a service animal, so on and so forth. So if you have somebody, they're like, hey, can you, fill my dog's bowl up? The answer is no, right? So there's a lot more to that. I'd be happy to discuss if anybody has any kind of questions. The other thing, what this does not do, and I'll be very quick on this, this does not talk about emotional support animals. So an emotional support animal is anything other than what we've just been talking about, right? A dog, or a dog, unless it's a pony. An emotional support animal under the employer responsibilities under the ADA, they do not have to let that, they do not have to honor that reasonable accommodation. I'll say that again. An employer does not have to let people in or let emotional support animals in. Now, some employers do allow that, reasonable accommodations. Other employers do not. It's just general policy, right? I've got one large employer. I mean, when I say large, I'm talking about huge, right? And they're like, nope, no emotional support animals. Don't care who it is, don't care what it is. They don't want to open that floodgate, right? So under the ADA, also the ADA does not cover emotional support animals. That is covered under the Fair Housing Authority, FHA, I believe. Emotional support animals, there are some rules in reference to whether people can have emotional support animals in homeless shelters, in barracks and dorms and things like that. That's all covered under the Housing Authority or the Housing Administration. ADA has nothing to do with that. So just wanted to mention that. All right. let's talk for a quick second about assistive and adaptive technology. So we're getting into the world now where universal design is becoming a thing in technology as well. I was just reading yesterday where the new Apple earbuds, the brand new one, the Earbud Pro, is also a hearing aid. I don't know if you guys have heard that. So they're turning it into a hearing aid where you can actually push a button and it'll give you a hearing test. And then it'll kind of, right ear, left ear kind of thing. And it'll do all its little computer things and you can use them as a hearing aid. Now, there's a question is whether they're as good as the ones on the market. I would say probably not at this point, but I think we're going to get to that point. So in my mind, that's an example of universal design. But at the same time, a lot of this stuff that we're buying now, when you buy a computer and it's got Microsoft applications on it, there's a lot of this disability access hardware, software built right into these machines that you're buying. And we're going to continue to see this get more and more prevalent as time goes on. But I know it's a big kind of a confusion with employers. So screen readers like JAWS are used for those who are blind, can cost about $1,300. And this is a one-time fee, right? You buy a license to that kind of thing. It's a one-time fee. Screen magnifiers, and there are a lot of different types, are used for individuals who have low vision, and these can range anywhere from $50 to $2,000, again, depending on how much you want to spend. Accessibility features in computer suites like Google, Microsoft, and others are already built in, like I said, to most devices that you already have in your workplace. You simply need to know how to enable them. Those of you with IT departments, it's a little bit easier for some of those smaller businesses. We do have conversations with them about adaptive tech and accessibility when it comes to individuals in the workplace. But the important thing to remember is that most of these are free, right? And if they're not free, they're very low cost. When we start talking about things like JAWS, which is a screen reader, like I said, that can be $1,300, but it's a one-time cost. So it's important to understand that. All right, let's talk about best practices and resources. We're kind of getting towards the end. As we lead into our last portion of today's presentation, I've mentioned a few times now that I'll be providing you with resources to further your education and understanding of the ADA. But I also want to leave you with some best practices that you can begin to embrace right away. Remember, building a place of employment that is inclusive and diverse does take time, it takes effort, and it takes the ability to adapt again and again as we learn new things. That's the important thing to remember about this. Our training always changes. Life always changes. So what I'm talking about today, I might not be talking about next year or 5 years down the road, right? But it also takes a continued commitment to begin and to be an employer of choice for people with disabilities. So I talk a lot about Amazon. Love them, hate them, but they are an employer of choice when it comes to individuals with disabilities. We know that the general public, 26%, more or less, given a point, self-identify as having some kind of a disability. Probably a lot more than that actually have real disabilities, but choose not to self-identify. So we know that 26% of the people in your workforce, at least, have disabilities, right? Amazon's getting to the point where they want 26% of their workforce to be individuals with disabilities. They have whole teams out there that are reaching out to individuals with disabilities to hire them. They want their global workforce to reflect the global population. So they are somebody who strives to be an employer of choice, just as an example. All right, so there are 3 steps to embrace. The first one is to have introspection and recognize the barriers of your hiring practices, recognizing the barriers they may be presenting. Identifying policies you have in place for providing accommodations. And the second step is to be proactive, to increase your company's knowledge and awareness of the diversity gaps to identify partners and resources to be working with you so that your organization can continue to hire individuals with disabilities, and to develop recruitment and retention strategies for employment for those individuals with disabilities. And the third one is to empower your people, to utilize the resources that could support your company goals, to make top management committed to and start to mentor the internal staff on hiring individuals with disabilities, and to utilize those programs. And at the end of the day, to employ people with disabilities and provide support when needed. All right, here's a few best practices in hiring strategies. It starts with the top management. Again, if I could say anything about this, it would be that's where it starts. This does not start from the bottom up. This starts from the top and goes down. This is about company culture. There are incentives. I talk a lot about incentives. There are incentives. There are employer tax credits. There's training and education that we can help provide. There are ERGs. I ran into an ERG question about, what if we have people with autism and they start an ERG? Our lawyers are telling us that it could turn into a union, so there's some legal stuff that I was asked about for the first time, but ERGs are really important. I'm very proud of the state of Colorado. We have a number of different ERGs. We have one called OWL that I'm a part of. It's the Older, Wiser Learning Group. And so it's a bunch of us 55 and older folks that are part of that ERG. There's mentoring, there's use of assistive technology, which we've talked about. And you can always use a little creating or updating policies and procedures, right? I know you're all like, oh, I love it. Or spaces, and I could talk about universal design all day long, right? So we want to get to a place in our world where somebody with a disability, regardless of their disability, can walk into the workplace and not request a reasonable accommodation, because there's already everything built into their culture, into their systems that they would need. All right, here's a few other resources for you. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And I think it's important to say that the ADA is a law. A law cannot enforce itself. So you will never find the ADA enforcing any of what we've been talking about today. That is the job of the EEOC, right? So there you go. There's their information. The Rocky Mountain ADA Center of Colorado Springs is great. There are different ADA centers throughout the United States. Rocky Mountain ADA, without bias, I believe, is one of the best. They have some of the best training programs, a lot of free resources on their programs. The next one I use all the time, it's called JAN, or Ask Jan, the Job Accommodations Network. If you have somebody who has a disability and they ask you for a reasonable accommodation, you can go to askjan.com and find out, here's a list of all the reasonable accommodations that they may need or they may want, right? You can look something up by disability, you can look it up by reasonable accommodation. They just have a whole bunch of information, which is great. And then the Colorado Office of Employment First, there's that information for you as well. And then there's me, right? Your local DVR office. That is my phone number, 970-657-9488. Please feel free to give me a call. And my email address is really easy. It's just adam.shake@state.co.us. And so I want to thank you again for your time today and allowing me to present you this topic. And at this point, I will go ahead and stop sharing and open it up for any questions that you may have.
I actually really appreciated the information about the learning screens and all that. That is something we are actively looking into. The other part of that, to accommodate those employees who do have a learning disability and struggle with reading and writing and all of that, are there other platforms that encompass this type of setup, like JAWS or something, or Microsoft or any of those, with a writing capability?
A writing capability. That's actually a really good question. And Linda, I'm so glad you're here because I'm going to refer back to you. Linda may have the answer to this. She's been with DVR a lot longer than I have.
Thank you.
I think there are some tools that are available that basically I can speak into a microphone, dictate what I want to say, and it will clean up some of the language, and then it'll read it back to me and make sure that what I've said or what it translated for me is what I said. And I can get a little bit more information on that because there are some pretty good tools.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll route it through Adam.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that voice to text, I know it's come a long, long way, and I think Microsoft might even have some of this built into it. But I'm sure for a couple dollars, you could probably, double your quality. What's in the Microsoft free suite kind of thing. I know I even have a problem with my text because I tend to talk to text a lot when I'm sending a text because I have big fat fingers, right? And I'm always making mistakes. I'm not as good as the kids when it comes to texting stuff. So yeah, it continues to improve, but we'll find out if there are any other resources that we can share with you.
Thank you both.
Yep. Mark, you got anything?
If I can unmute myself, my story has been always about how do we get them in the door to as employees, especially with organizations that have lots of applicants and candidates, and they just get lost in that shuffle.
Yeah.
What is a legitimate legal way to give them a head start?
Yeah, I know you're absolutely right. So I'll share one anecdote, and I don't have the answer for it yet, but I've got a major employer who wants to hold some jobs back, right? Hold some position descriptions
Like reserve
back.
those.
Reserve those. I guess that's a really good way to put it. And so they're having their legal team look into how they can do that legally. So that's kind of ongoing. If I hear about that, I'd be happy to share. But I think here's one example of what I talk about a little bit. Men, when it comes to criteria for a job position, when they're reading it on Indeed or USA Jobs or whatever, they are less likely to, or let me put it this way: they are more likely to apply for that position if they
Even if they're not qualified.
if they're not qualified, right?
Yeah.
Women a little bit less so, right? Women really are like a little bit more, oh, I'm almost there, but I'm not quite qualified under that one bullet point, so I'm not going to apply.
Right.
Individuals with disabilities, even more so.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where I talk about that job description. Those essential functions, when they're written in there, are so important, right? Because if you don't have must have a driver's license. If that is not an essential function of the job that you're hiring for, you're losing a lot of folks that may be disabled.
Well,
right?
even those that will apply don't really have much of a shot.
Exactly. Yeah. So without knowing how to change the system myself, I think it
Let me
for
actually
me
hear
it
about
really,
that. Yeah,
it really comes down to a lot of those kinds of things. So
challenging.
thanks, Mark.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Anyone else?
I did have one more question related to emotional support dogs. I know that's not part of the ADA. Where could we go to get more information on that, if you know?
Yeah, I think if you go to askjan.org, you can find more information on that as well. Or if you can't find information, you should be able to find some resources on there about more about emotional support animals.
Okay, we'll definitely check that, and then the Fair Housing Authority. So thank you.
Excellent. You're welcome. Well, again, I want to thank you all for coming today. I appreciate your time. And please feel free to reach out to me. Like I said, adam.shake, like shake and bake, shake, rattle, and roll, at state.co.us. So please feel free to reach out to me.
Really appreciate all this information. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you, Adam, so much for being here today for our Tuesday Talent Series. And we'll send these recordings out to anybody that RSVP'd for this group, as well as they'll be available on the Chamber of Commerce's YouTube channel if you need to look for those. And thank you guys so much. We have another Talent Tuesday coming up next week, so I'd love to see you all, and I look forward to seeing you at the Workforce Symposium.
Excellent.
Thank
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.